The Economics of Addiction and Prohibition. Many youth are killed in gang violence over drugs. Take a minute to do your guiding questions before you proceed. Start by recording this slide number. How would you define addiction? In your opinion, what is the integral element which determines whether something is an addiction or not? Pause here and write it down. Now, how would you define commitments? What does it mean to make a commitment? So write down that as well. So pause here and write down your definition of addiction and your definition of commitment. I'm going to come back to both of them later, but let's look at one example of commitment, brand loyalty. Remember Coke and Pepsi? Classical example of substitutes. Imagine someone who's a big fan of Coke. They would insist on having Coke. That's brand loyalty. Or someone who only shops in one store from one provider, not just because it's close or convenient, but they have a commitment. Sellers would love this, by the way. That's why they come up with rewards programs to hook their customers and dissuade them from going elsewhere, to create that bond. So brand loyalty means you become their consumer not only once today, but from now on, into the future. Is that rational? Of course it is. It's a calculated decision because even the loyalists still respond to anticipated changes in price. Now we can define commitments. It's when we narrow our choices to one option. That's called temporal complements. You might be like, what the hell is that? It's when current and future consumptions become complements. Remember car and gas? You consume them together as a bundle. They complement each other. Now you might be like, hang on, why would anyone in their right mind limit their own choice? There could be a number of reasons for it, such as having a special taste for a product, or searching for alternatives may be too much a headache. So if you found a service that does the job for you and has good quality, you might as well stick to it. A brand may give you a sense of identity, and perhaps the most important of all, commitments remove indecision. This is called the paradox of choice, which is an amazing psychological phenomenon. The studies show that having more choice actually reduces our satisfaction. It's more peaceful when we commit ourselves and close our eyes and ears. Anyway, commitment is a rational decision that's made by billions of people over history. So pause here, record this slide number, and summarize it in one sentence using your own words. You can also look at addiction as a form of commitment. This is a very neat definition which can help us make more profound sense of addictive behavior. By the way, one could be addicted to practically anything. It doesn't have to be alcohol or drugs, it could be anything. So write down your own example. Is there something that you are addicted to? Maybe your cell phone? Either way, what happens in addiction is that consuming X today induces you to consume it tomorrow. Sometimes we resort to a substance as a way of coping with stress, then more stress would create more dependence. It solidifies our relationship. Oh no, what a mess. And sometimes you hear people say, I can't stop, I need it, I have no choice, I wish I could quit. And there's a theory for it that people are short-sighted in an irrational way. And at some level, these statements may be true, but ultimately they're fallacies. Why? Because even the most hardcore addicts respond to changes in price, income, information, and cost of quitting. So I'm hooked really means that I've hooked myself, and I can come out. It may not be easy, but I still have the choice. Let's not deny our agency. We do it knowingly, and we can adjust our consumption levels based on current and future changes in our environment. We can't live without water or air, but we can live without addictive substances and habits. And that's the whole difference between essentials and addictions. We treat an addiction like a necessity, but we choose to consume it. And this is a rational choice because it gives us utility. In other words, addictive behavior is no different from other forms of human behavior. Pause and take notes. Specialization is another form of commitment where we dedicate ourselves to a given field, and it's rational because we can build comparative advantage, enhance our productivity, and then trade, as opposed to being self-sufficient, which is not efficient. Overall, it's beneficial to all sides, and it's called division of labor. So this term is synonymous to specialization, and both are quite important in economics. How about marriage or long-term relationship? Can you think of it as a form of brand loyalty or addiction or specialization? It's a mutual commitment to a certain form of behavior from now on. It's also, that's cool. It's also a form of being hooked. It's a commitment to do certain forms of social exchange with only one person. So this lifestyle category itself is quite big, like where to live and one's social circle. Basically, a long-term relationship means mutual decision-making for life. We intertwine our fate and future with another person, and this is even more true about having kids, where we are limiting our future options to our current choice. Future consumption becomes a complement to current consumption, and there is no return policy, buddy. Oh no, what have you done? What does the law of demand say? When the price of something goes up, people are gonna buy less. And what does the law of supply say? When the price goes up, the sellers are gonna sell more, ceteris paribus. Now the question is, by how much? And the answer to that comes with the concept of elasticity, right? So if you think of an elastic, it's kind of special because you can do a lot of cool things with it, exactly because it is responsive, right? And that's the gist of elasticity. It's sensitivity, it's flexibility. So if you think of a spring, some springs are pretty rigid and some other ones are more flexible. That's their elasticity. So in economics, elasticity is the responsiveness of quantity demanded or quantity supplied to a change in price. And the determining factor is the availability of substitutes. So the question you should ask is, can you do without it? If so, then you are elastic. If you can't do without it, then you are inelastic. So the more alternatives a buyer or seller can find to a transaction, the more elastic they are in that given transaction. So pause here and write something for which you have an elastic demand and another one for which you have an inelastic demand, and record the slide number. Something has inelastic demand if people would buy it no matter what, like basic necessities and addictions, or think of the ultimate need. Oh no. And if something has elastic demand, then when the price goes up a bit, people are like, screw it, dude, I'm out of here, because they don't need it. We call them luxuries. Now apply the same logic for supply and write what is elastic supply and what is inelastic supply. Whenever someone insists on something, then they are inelastic. And in terms of the graphs, the demand or supply which is inelastic would be pretty steep, and if they are elastic, they would be flat. So draw a demand curve in your notes for something addictive, like what? Something addictive like crack. And then do the same, do a separate diagram where you show the demand curve for something non-addictive, such as crackers. Prohibition is based on a simple observation that certain things are harmful, which is a normative statement. The question is, so what? If something is harmful, should it be banned? The intentions may be good, but that's not enough. We must see the results. I'll consider the case of hard drugs like cocaine, but the same logic applies to other substances. You can even consider other forms of prohibition like gay marriage or abortion. Most of what I say here applies to any prohibition, but not all of them. The underlying assumption of prohibition law is that people are like children, incapable of looking after themselves. So far, not so bad. There may be even some psychological evidence to support it. But paternalism goes further, and that's where it becomes problematic. It follows that the big brother must look after them. It must protect the people from their own foolishness. And remember, as an economist, you must always compare available alternatives. Is this the best alternative that we have? So pause here and summarize the slide. Did you see that? It shattered. Make sure you follow the logical sequence here. Prohibition laws target the sellers because it's easier to go for one dealer with a supply chain than for many buyers who are spread out. So supply drops, and that creates a shortage, and that pushes up the price of the substance. Now, what does the law of demand say? When the price goes up, people buy less, but in this case, it won't be a big drop in consumption since it is addictive. Now, that's the logic. It also helps to show this on a graph, and you should be able to do it. So draw a neat supply curve for yourself and shift it to the left. And your demand curve should be fairly steep since it is inelastic. Then see what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity. The demand would also shift because buyers will have a lower willingness to pay since it's a crime. But let's not complicate your graph because that's going to be a mess. So just do a supply shift. So pause here and do a neat graph for yourself. Now you might be like, hang on, how can they afford buying the same quantity if the price is higher and more expensive? Well, it means that they're cutting on other expenses to meet the marginal increase in the costs of the drug. So the addicts end up spending less on the education and health of themselves and their family. Is that what you wanted? Besides, the whole thing goes underground. And who benefits from all this? Not the poor farmers in Colombia, but the bad guys who earn the higher profit. That's a compensation for the risk that they're taking, like Pablo Escobar, who became a billionaire in Colombia and also lost his life for it. And with all that money, now they can cheat the system. And in terms of the officers, they will also have the incentive to look the other way. If you're still in the normative mode, you might be like, bad cop, bad officer. But look, they too are humans, not angels. They're making a rational choice. If we want to judge prohibition by its results, then it's not very effective. It's a mess. Even though its intentions and objectives are noble, it defeats its purpose. Here you should really say, oh no, what have you done? Prohibition induces violence because of the new marginal benefits and costs that it creates for the sellers. Now it's worth to kill each other. And it has a greater return for those who have those kinds of skills. It also modifies the marginal benefits and costs of buyers in a degenerating way. And if there's a dispute, contentious parties cannot hire lawyers to resolve their problem, so they'll resort to violence. And the biggest victims here are the weakest, who can't defend themselves. You see this especially in prostitution. Those poor women and helpless girls are the first victims of prohibition because they can't go to any legal or medical authority for support. When we ban a drug or cut off a supply line, it simply gets rerouted and bulges out somewhere else. So the balloon effect is a special form of unintended consequences in the context of drug prohibition. And since there are many forms of crops in several places, it's practically impossible to fight and eliminate all of them in a top-down targeted fashion. It's simply not effective. It's just a waste of resources and filling the prisons with drug-related criminals and killing so many people along the way. Congratulations. The drug war is just a pacifier. Now you might be like, hang on, so why does it exist? There are several reasons for it. One of them is it's good publicity. It's a political scheme to win votes for being tough on crimes and scapegoating those evil drug dealers and addicts. It also creates funding and jobs for many government agencies who are involved in the process, so they have the incentive to keep it running. There are also strong lobbies for it in the US by weapon industries because they get to sell more. And all this was part of the US imperialism in Latin America to stop the spread of communism. The war on drugs was only a cover-up for their military intervention to preserve their sphere of influence. Countries like Colombia and Mexico receive American funding for drug wars so that they can buy back weapons from the US. It's a self-serving aid, like all international aid, so that they can kill themselves. There were 60,000 drug-related homicides in Mexico over the 6 years of Felipe Calderón's presidency in the 2000s. It's really tragic, and all the poisoning destroys their agricultural sector. And here's a chart which shows you the balloon effect between Colombia and Mexico. So take notes on this. Wow, that was nice. Even if prohibition is successful and there is no bribery, it won't be a free lunch. There will be lower production and consumption of drugs, but more of other crimes. So it's a form of favoritism. In the US, about 30% of all prisoners are there for a drug-related offense. Another unintended consequence is that if you're gonna risk selling or buying something illegal, you may as well go for the higher dose. And that's the idea of potency. To save on quantity. The goal was to reduce drug use, but it ends up being the exact opposite. And people are going to intoxicate themselves even more. You know, what have you done? So that's the idea of having a high marginal benefit for a greater dose, but almost a zero marginal cost. In a black market with huge monopolies and violence, there is no incentive to maintain quality. There is a lack of information about the products, and all this inefficiency harms the very people that the law was supposed to help and rescue. They are helplessly exploited. An example of that are crack babies, because their mothers can't go and get medical support since they'll be incriminating themselves. And this last item also applies to abortion. Even in countries which strictly ban abortion, there is still a black market for it. So if a woman really wants to get abortion, she's gonna get it. But those poor girls who resort to these underground services are its first victims. There is no assurance of quality and no legal obligation. If a woman is forced to have a baby that she doesn't want to, chances are that she will not take good care of that baby. That's why when abortion was legalized in the US in 1973, the crime rate dropped about 20 years after that. So those babies who were not going to receive proper upbringing were not born to begin with. These are called unintended consequences. At some point, we should wonder if the goal is to reduce human suffering, are we really doing it? So you can still hold any moral value or judgment that you have about drugs or abortion or anything, but ask yourself, is prohibition an effective means towards that end? Is top-down enforcement really the way to go? Even in the case of murder, we saw that it's not desirable to reduce murder to zero because of its opportunity cost. So pause here and summarize this slide. For effective alternatives, we need to be creative and also patient, because lasting bottom-up solutions take time. Either way, it must take into account the incentives of people. Drug consumption may be harmful, but who said it's a crime? And if it is, what level of priority should it be given? Economics makes us sensitive about the reality of scarcity and trade-off. So our tendency for perfectionism drops because we realize that it takes its toll in other areas. Remember, your first response to any decision or suggestion should be at what expense and what alternatives are there. It's not enough to show the benefits or importance of something. You must look at the sacrifice as well. Once you become a parent, you're going to learn this the hard way. Prohibition doesn't work. It's just going to bulge out somewhere else or goes under the table. The good news is that drug sellers and users are rational. That is, they respond to incentives, and they get into drugs because the expected returns of other activities are lower for them. So instead of banning drugs, we must provide healthier opportunities in the society to compete with that incentive. And that's what we see in students of your age. Once you see high returns to education, you won't risk it by getting into drugs so much. That's a bottom-up development through having a more vibrant economy, where people don't feel stuck in the social class they're born into. A victimless crime refers to when a product for which there is a demand is outlawed, such as drugs, alcohol, and gambling. Why should anyone dictate what others can or can't put into their body? Now you might be like, hang on, it also harms others and the society. Sure, but is that worse than alcohol and tobacco? The most harmful drug by far is alcohol, and it was banned in the US from 1920 to 1933, but it was a total failure. It was the only case they had to repeal an amendment to the Constitution. They were like, oh no, what have we done? Pause here. Wow, that was cool. Babies and sex are complements, and birth control is a kind of technology which reduces the price of one item, which means that the total package becomes more affordable. And when the price of anything goes down, its quantity demanded goes up, especially when it's more elastic, as in the case of premarital sex. That can explain why out-of-wedlock births increased after the pill. And because of all this mess, the stigma around premarital sex drops, including shame. Now, when you see the norms and values of other societies in other nations or in the past, don't look down upon them. Don't be quick to judge them as backward or inhumane. They had as much intelligence and integrity as we do. These are rational responses, defense mechanism, to the expected values that they faced. This also shows how dynamic moral intuitions are, so let's not be too confident about what is so obvious to us, because it was not evident at all to them and vice versa. Now, from the economics point of view, birth control is very much comparable to abortion, in the sense that they reduce the cost. You can think of birth control as prevention and abortion as cure. Oh no, I shouldn't have said that. Now, you might be like, what are the consequences of abortion legalization? So one of them is that those who don't want to settle no longer had to fear shotgun marriages. How about the consequences for the babies? Now, this is quite interesting. So here's a bunch of consequences. Wow, that's cool. Oh, I love this picture. Now, here's the logic behind it. When people don't want something and it's forced upon them, it's going to have unintended consequences. What happens is that they're going to pass on the cost to someone else. When someone is denied abortion, it is likely that they won't invest much in the child. So with abortion, children who have the highest chance of becoming criminals are not born, and those who are born are more likely to stay in school and receive more parental investment. Another similar case is the one-child policy in China, which had its own unintended consequences. It also affects the women. It does not affect the lifetime fertility of women because it's a matter of timing. So it just enables women to time when to have their kids. So abortion obviously empowers women since it gives them more options, and teenage motherhood dropped by one-third. Now, something quite important is that abortion primarily affects people of low income, which often happen to be racial minorities. And because they are likely to engage in risky sex due to lack of information, lack of resources, or low opportunity costs, it's more applicable to them. So abortion reduces racial inequality. And here you see that unintended consequences don't have to be negative all the time. To wrap this up, all of us value life. The dilemma is that abortion reduces the quantity of life, but enhances its quality. Which one do we give a higher priority? Economics can't answer what is more ethical, but it shows us the trade-off. Whenever we choose, we must sacrifice the other. There is no escape from economic decision-making. The abortion decision is no different from any other rational choice, and it's not just for unwanted pregnancies. Many of those who abort their pregnancies were planned, but they discover things later that change their mind. So you can think of abortion as an insurance. It covers a cost. Oh, I hate that picture. Unlike any other insurance, it can cause more irresponsible behavior. However, there are still major costs to abortion even in countries which are champions of liberty. There is still much stigma, secrecy around it, not to mention the emotional drain at the personal level. And all of these are costs of abortion. Even legal abortion is a very taxing and difficult decision. So it's not a perfect substitute for birth control. Now, how much birth control should one practice? Well, the idea is that the more one tries to protect oneself, it becomes increasingly costly with smaller incremental returns. And at some point, one would rather face the risk of pregnancy to avoid additional costs. So the optimal level of safety is not 100% because of scarcity. So the rule of thumb is as long as the marginal cost of contraception is lower than the expected cost of pregnancy, then use it. Once it's not, then stop. I don't know why I put that picture there, but it made sense when I did. So copy this slide number and summarize it in one sentence for yourself. All right, you made it to the end, my friend. Before I forget, there is this awesome book, Freakonomics, which makes economics very accessible to the general public with a lot of cool applications. So I really recommend it. So take a few minutes and try to see how you can answer these questions based on what you learned today. Pause here. Prohibition of something inelastic will raise potency, reduce transparency, come with the risk of bribery, raise hazard pay, create a black market, and cause the balloon effect. And this happens because of addiction, which can be defined as temporal complements. And an example of that is brand loyalty or specialization, which are meant to avoid search costs and paradox of choice. I would emphasize the concept of elasticity here as well as balloon effect. So do your own concept map here. Try to use maybe some other concepts that are missing from this one, and make sure it is not exactly the same as mine. How would you analyze our overarching scenario given what you learned today? So pause and take a few minutes, record the slide number, and re-answer the 4 guiding questions in your notes before I show you the sample answer. So a student wrote, the incentives could be high expected benefit versus low expected costs, and that the demand for drugs is inelastic. A top-down approach would be prohibiting drugs or more government funding to fight drugs. That will likely create greater monopolies for drug dealers, and they will have the incentive to bribe. An alternative is to decriminalize drugs, which will increase the supply and competition, resulting in greater quality and lower incentive for violence. Thanks for your patience.